Economic Objectivity and Negative Dialectics, On Class and Struggle, by Werner Bonefeld. This is from Adorno and Marx. The chapter presents negative dialectics as a dialectics of society in the form of the economic object. Negative dialectics refuses to accept the economic categories as categories of economic nature. Instead, it sets out to expose them as categories of historically specific social relations. Its conception of economic nature as a socially constituted nature entails the class antagonism in the concept of economic objectivity. Negative dialectics is the presentation of capitalist social praxis in the form of seemingly independent economic categories. The assertion that Adorno's negative dialectics amounts to a critique of the constituted relations of economic objectivity is not a common view. Martin J. and Jürgen Habermas no less have argued that Adorno's critical theory did not concern itself with political economy or economics, be it bourgeois economics or Marxian economics. However, what would a critical theory of society amount to if it were not to concern itself with the manner in which society maintains itself? Why really does this content, human social reproduction, take the form of seemingly self-moving economic forces, and what therefore is the content of these economic forces? Adorno's characterization of negative dialectics as a critique of the, quote, ontology of the wrong state of things, end quote, which is to establish that, quote, all concepts, even the philosophical ones, refer to non-conceptualities, end quote, does not exclude the economic concepts. Even the philosophical concepts are not excluded. According to Adorno, quote, illusion dominates reality, end quote, and it does so because, quote, exchange value, merely a mental configuration, when compared with use value, dominates human needs and replaces human needs, end quote, Adorno. The subtitle, On Class and Struggle, comprises a second uncommon view. Critical theory is normally discussed as an immanent critique of philosophical concepts, social phenomenon, and cultural experiences, not as a negative dialectics of political economy and its class theory. The chapter holds that the negative dialectics of the relations of economic objectivity recognize human suffering and social struggles as the non-conceptual premise of the economic categories. The non-conceptual is not only the vanished premise of the economic concept of, say, price. The non-conceptual also appears in it, with a price tag. It is, however, the case that Jürgen Habermas introduced a theory of social practice as communicative action. For Habermas, communicative action is the means of reason, which announces itself in public speeches and pronouncements and parliamentary deliberations. Communicative action is about the achievement of a civilized society. In distinction, the class struggle, which is about, quote, crude and basic material things, end quote, belongs to an uncivilized society in which the class tied to work struggles to make a living. Indeed, one could argue that communicative action is the means of overcoming the conflicts and hardships of a class-ridden society through the application of reason. It is to civilize bourgeois society for the sake of humanity, peace, and tranquility according to the norms of justice, equality, and liberty. Axel Honneth's, I think that's how you pronounce his name, theory of recognition expands on Habermas. According to Axel Honneth, bourgeois society contains within itself the, quote, promise of freedom, end quote. This would suggest that bourgeois society also contains within itself the, quote, promise, end quote, of a freedom from want and therewith from the class struggle to make ends meet. For the sake of this freedom, Honnet's argument implies that the existing form of society has to develop its potential to the full in order to make good on the promises. In this view, the struggle for access to crude material things, the satisfaction of human needs, is not innate to capitalist society. Rather, it manifests a social pathology of unfreedom that can be overcome through a politics of social justice or recognition. Bourgeois society ought to be civil, just and fair in the treatment of its workers. Who would object to that view? Yet what really does that mean? In contrast to the contemporary critical theory represented by Honnet and Habermas, Adorno understood that in capitalist society, quote, the needs of human beings, the satisfaction of human beings, is never more than a sideshow, end quote. For Adorno, the, quote, total movement of society, end quote, is, quote, antagonistic from the outset, end quote. And, quote, society remains class struggle, end quote. For Adorno, what existing society promises is not freedom from one. Rather, existing society promises that those without property, free traders and labor power, will have to struggle to make a living. The presentation of Adorno's negative dialectics as a critique of society in the form of the economic object takes its cue from Max Horkheimer's remarks that, quote, human beings produce through their own labor a reality that increasingly enslaves them, end quote. And that, therefore, Marx's critique of political economy amounts to a, quote, judgment on existence, end quote. The account starts with a section on economic objectivity as the subject matter of negative dialectics. It argues that, quote, materialism is not the dogma indicated by clever opponents, but a dissolution of things understood as dogmatic, end quote. Then follows a section on Adorno's dictum that, quote, society remains class struggle, end quote. It argues that class is a negative category, and it develops this point with reference to Adorno's critique of the capitalist exchange relations. The final section, looking on the bright side of the wronged world, is the conclusion. It sums up the negative dialectics of economic objectivity and argues that, like Marx's critique of political economy, it too is a manifestation of philosophy's search for the good and reasonable organization of life. It holds that, quote, there is a tenderness only in the coarsest demand, that no one should go hungry any more, end quote. Economic objectivity and negative dialectics. In the disciplinary division of academic labor, Adorno's negative dialectics as a critique of bourgeois society in the form of the economic object is found wanting. Sociology is the dedicated science of the society. According to the established view, sociology deals with the relationships between people. It analyzes interpersonal relationships, quote, without paying too much attention to their objectified economic forms, end quote. It observes the social relations and analyzes the social facts and attributes meaning to them and then classifies their social attributions into ideal typical models of social interaction, without ever once asking itself why society organizes its reproduction in the form of independent economic categories of profit, cash, and rent. It considers the comprehension of the forms of social wealth, conceived by Marx as the independent ghost-like movement of value, as a matter of economics. However, like sociology, economics, as the dedicated science of economic matter, does not pay attention to the objectified forms either. Economics recognizes economic quantities, represents those economic quantities' movements with mathematical accuracy, rationalizes the economic aspects of society with the help of algebraic formulae, predicts on the basis of available economic data what markets will do next, describes the manner in which the human agents have to adjust to market demands for the sake of achieving greater economic efficacy, and explores the means of state as the public authority of economic regulation to achieve optimum factor efficiency. For the sake of economic progress measured by the rate of growth. For economic thought, the essence of economics is not man, Mensch, her needs and desires. Rather, the essence of economics is economic nature, which it presumes to be valid because of itself. Yet it does not tell us what it is. Economics ascribes subjective power to economic things and argues that the movements of economic quantities express value preferences, which reveal a rationality of economic action that expresses itself in the form of price movements, which manifest a dynamic of competition that, quote, is supposed to keep the whole process alive and even cause it to progress, as if it were moved by a, quote, invisible hand, end quote, end quote. As the designated science of economic matter, economics translates quantities of, quote, capital, end quote, into algebra, and on the condition of undistorted competition in undivided markets, assigns the power of economic regulation to some omnipotent invisible hand that tells the social individuals what to buy, where to invest, how to achieve optimum factor efficiency of themselves as embodiments of human capital. There really is, as Dirk Bronstein remarked dryly, no economist by the name of Adorno. Nor is there a sociologist by the name of Adorno. According to Adorno, negative dialectics, quote, flouts tradition, end quote. And he argues that the division between economics and sociology, quote, sets aside the really central interests of both disciplines, end quote. Neither focuses on the manner in which society organizes the satisfaction of its needs, and neither concerns itself with a specific form of capitalist wealth. Money that yields more money. Its production, circulation, law of movement, and its financial forms and crisis-ridden character. In the hands of the economists, economic laws are, quote, metamorphosed into a pretended law of nature, end quote. And for the sociologist, quote, society is nothing but the average of individual reactive moves, end quote. Both disciplines recognize that the social conflicts have to do with the competitive struggle over the distribution of wealth, who gets what and how much, yet neither scrutinizes the social relations of production. Quote, what is entirely overlooked is that this conflict of interest, as manifested in competition, is itself a dilute derivative of much deeper conflicts, those between classes. The former conflicts are really the ones which take place after the central conflict over the control of the means of production has already been decided, so that the competition is carried on within the sphere of an already appropriated surplus value, end quote. Adorno. A few notable exceptions apart, there is hardly a book or journal article that raises the issue of economic objectivity as a topic of negative dialectics, and this despite Adorno's insistence that, quote, a critical theory of society is represented prototypically by that of Marx, end quote. Marx argues Adorno directed his critique of political economy, quote, at the substance, end quote, of society, that is, the, quote, social production and reproduction of the life of society as a whole, end quote. For Marx, the focus of critique in the social relations of production, that is, the, quote, actual given relations of life which have become apotheosized, end quote, in the form of seemingly self-moving economic forces that economic science sets out to quantify with mathematical precision, and that sociology fails to recognize when it investigates interpersonal relations based on income, labor market position, educational status, gender, ethnicity, health, etc. Adorno captures this process of the inversion of social relations into seemingly self-moving, mysterious economic forces when he argues that, quote, the objective rationality of society, namely that of exchange, continues to distance itself through its own dynamic from the model of logical reason. Consequently, society, what has been made independent, is in turn no longer intelligible. Only the law of becoming independent is intelligible." End quote. The recognition of society as an recognition of society as an autonomic economic subject entails its critique. What appears in the appearance of society as a movement of real economic abstractions? How is it that, quote, "the life of all men hangs by, quote, it"? And what gives it a consciousness and a will? Social reproduction governed by, quote, "real economic abstractions," end quote, entails both chance and necessity, which are experienced as, quote, "fate," end quote. The mythological idea of fate becomes no less mythical when it is demythologized into a The mythological idea of fate becomes no less mythical when it is demythologized, quote, into a secular, quote, "logic of things," end quote, that on the pain of ruin judges the actions of the actual individuals in cold, exacting ways. Such fate is a category of a ghost-like society. Its secret is, however, not some invisible hand that regulates the economic development. Rather, and as argued since Marx, what manifests itself, quote, "behind the backs of the acting subjects is their own work," end quote. And it is their own work that endows the cold society of economic reason with a will, and that condemns them as economic, quote, "character masks," end quote, Adorno, or, quote, "personifications of economic categories," end quote. That is, quote, "the social relations do not appear as direct social relations between persons and their work, but rather as material relations between persons and social relations between things," end quote. Adorno's conception of dialectics has to be understood against this background. It is to find out what is active in things and holds sway in them, and what holds sway in them asserts itself only over the social individuals, not only over the social individuals, but also through and by means of the social individuals. Negative dialectics refuses, quote, "to lend itself to sanctioning things as they are," end quote. Intended as a theory without, quote, "affirmative traits," end quote, negative dialectics purports to demystify rigidified thing-like congealed relationships, rendering their immediacy transparent as socially constituted things that are imbued and endowed with an independent will and consciousness through the social practices of the individuals that act in and through them as personifications of their own social world. For example, Marx writes that in The Money Fetish, quote, "a social relation, a definite relation between individuals, appears as a metal, a stone, as a purely physical external thing which can be found as such in nature and which is indistinguishable in form from its natural existence," end quote. There is only one world, and that is the world of appearances. What counts in money, and money counts only as more money. However, what is appearance an appearance of, and what therefore appears in appearance? The social objectivity of a, quote, "purely physical thing," end quote, Marx, that appears in the form of money as incarnation of social wealth, quote, "does not lead a life of its own," end quote. That is to say, the social relations assume the form of a relationship between things and make themselves manifest as a relationship between money and more money. Society in the form of self-moving economic objects remains social, however, perverted in its economic forms of appearance. That is, the social relations vanish in their economic appearance as a relationship between coined metals, and this appearance of the social relations is real. What appears in the appearance of society as a, quote, "stone," or a, quote, "coin," is thus a definite social relationship between individuals, subsisting as a relationship between, quote, "coins," end quote. In this, quote, "coined," end quote, relationship, The social individuals vanish only to reappear as personifications of economic reason. Some, quote, the owners of money, end quote, calculating the movement of economic quantities, winnings and losings. Others, the sellers of labor power, laboring for the sake of money as more money, which is the condition of maintaining themselves through sustained wage income. As argued previously, for Adorno, quote, all concepts, even the philosophical concepts, refer to non-conceptualities, end quote. Say the economic concept of profit entails what it is not. That is, it entails the definite social relations between individuals as the vanished premise of its economic force. What has vanished cannot be conceptualized. That is, quote, the definite social relations between men themselves. Assume here for them the fantastic form of a relation between things, end quote. And in this form, man in her social relations appears as a mere character mask of her own social world, a mere price-taking agent, quote, human material, end quote, for, quote, money which is worth more money, value which is greater than itself, end quote, capital which begets more capital, and which has thus succeeded in avoiding competitive erosion and the threat of bankruptcy, quote, through the conquest of social wealth, end quote, by means of the progressive accumulation of the extracted surplus value, and therewith the, quote, extension of the area of the exploited human material, end quote, that is under its sway. The social individuals are not visible in the movement of the economic quantities that govern them. Instead of personal relations of domination, capitalist society is ruled by abstractions. Their freedom is a freedom of economic compulsion. What counts is money is more money on the point of ruin. Their needs and desires are a metaphysical distraction to the calculation of all things economic. Nevertheless, as argued by Marx, this distraction is all important. Capital is not, quote, a very mystic being, end quote, of economic nature. It is a very mystic being of a definite form of social relations. Critically conceived, then, historical materialism, quote, opens up the non-conceptual with the aid of the concept, without reducing it to the concept, end quote. That is, historical materialism, critically conceived, explores the economic concept from within by thinking in and through the economic concept. And in this manner, it, quote, extinguishes the autarky of the concept, strips the blindfold from our eyes, that the concept is a concept, even when dealing with things in being, does not change the fact that on its part it is entwined with a non-conceptual whole, end quote. That is, the non-conceptuality of man in her social relations as the vanished premise of the economic object. For Adorno, therefore, the traditional notion of historical materialism as a materialism of the historically unfolding forces of production is in its entirely tied to the natural appearance of the existing social relations. Critically conceived, historical materialism is not a metaphysics of an unfolding economic nature that transitions the social relations from mode of production to mode of production, akin to Adam Smith's fable of the stages of history. Rather, it is critique of the existing relations of economic nature, one that dissolves the dogma of natural economic forces on a social basis. Economic nature is a social nature. Economic nature is a nature of the actual relations of life. Thus, historical materialism is critique of society in the form of economic object. It comprehends the forces of production as the forces of historically specific social relations. Man vanishes in her economic appearance, and her own sensuous practice manifests itself as the practice of sensuous, supersensible things that make the world go round, not in spite of the social individuals, but rather in and through and by means of them. What prevails over society exists through society. Adorno's dialectics is negative on the condition that it, quote, thinks, end quote, against the dazzling spell of the supersensible world of economic objectivity. It thinks, quote, in contradictions for the sake of the contradiction once experienced in the thing, and against that contradiction, end quote. It is, quote, suspicious of all identity, end quote, and it therefore resists the temptation to identify reified economic things. What appears in reification? What appears is the social relation in the form of a relationship between economic things. This appearance is as real as the fact that the producers of surplus value depend on the effectiveness of their exploitation, the profitability of their labor to make a living. Capitalist, quote, society stays alive, not despite its antagonism, but by means of it, end quote. Truth exists as an existing untruth. The fetishism of commodities does not distinguish the, quote, real, end quote, social relations. Rather, the fetishism of commodities expresses the, quote, real, end quote, social relations. The social individual is governed by the price mechanism, belongs to the price mechanism, and acts through the price mechanism as the existing calculus of their social reproduction, and as the living material of valorization, struggles to make ends meet as price taker. Society, in the form of the economic object, is bewitched. Society is governed by a ghost-like movement of incomprehensible economic quantities. However, their movement does not create the coldness of capitalist society. It represents the coldness of capitalist society, and as such, it presents it to the social individuals. The identity of the bewitched world of the economic categories is entirely abstract. It is governed by the specter of value, a ghost-like thing that appears in glimpses in the form of money, as more money. Just as the critique of religion does not criticize God on the basis of God, the critique of political economy does not criticize real economic abstractions on the basis of real economic abstractions. Rather, the critique of religion deciphers the social relations that assume the form of God and vanish in the idea of God only to reappear as cowed believers in God, mere human derivatives of divine rule. Similarly, the critique of economic objectivity is not a critique from the standpoint of economic nature. Like the critique of religion, it too deciphers the definite social relations that manifest themselves in mysterious, seemingly extra-mundane economic forms and forces that prevail in and through the social individuals as living personifications of their own world that manifests itself in the form of an independent movement of real economic abstractions, which compels them as living means of a process beyond their control. It thus explores the economic concept from within to comprehend the, quote, actual relations of life, end quote, that assume the form of value as a, quote, as a thing of, quote, nature. The independent movement of the economic forces of cash, rent, and profit manifests the, quote, objective necessity, end quote, of the existing relations of social reproduction, quote, to which we owe everything and yet threaten to bury us all, end quote. Adorno's dialectical theory, like Marx's, sets out to comprehend the social subject in the form of the reified object, that is, the demystification of society in the form of the economic object, is therefore more than just a matter of an ad hominem critique of the economic categories. It is also a reductio hominis. It is also a, quote, reductio hominis, an insight into the delusion of the subject that will style itself an absolute, end quote. What is reified? Appearance, shine, quote, is the enchantment of the subject in its own world, end quote. The essence, vescent of society manifests itself in the form of a, quote, fatal mischief, Unwesen, of a world that degrades men to means, end quote, and sets men loose as subjects to struggle to make ends meet, to compete and make profits, and if need be, to maim and kill. Madness characterizes the mode of reified men, mere personifications of their own social world set loose. In conclusion, negative dialectics is the presentation of the wrong state of things. Negative dialectics argues that the idea of society as, quote, subject to natural laws is ideology, if it is hypostatized as immutably given by nature, end quote. Instead, negative dialectics holds that the economic forces find their rational explanation in human social practice, and in the comprehension of this practice, however perverted this practice might be in the form of the economic object. Negative dialectics thus argues that the relations of economic objectivity manifest the social nature of an inverted Verkehrte and perverted Verrückte world of definite social relations. That is, it amounts, quote, to a conceptualized praxis, end quote, Begriff einer Praxis, end quote, of the capitalist social relations. Negative dialectics is the cunning of reason in a bewitched world.
Economic abstraction and class. I have argued that Adorno's critical theory holds that society in the form of self-moving economic categories is not intelligible. What remains intelligible is the, quote, law, end quote, of economic autonomization in the form of objectively valid exchange relations between one economic quantity and another. The social relationship disappears in the commodity form, which manifests the vanished social subject as a personification of a specter of ghost walking economic categories. Exchange value dominates use value, and exchange value manifests itself in money as the form of value. On the pain of ruin, use value production has to appear as production for money. Money needs to be made. Everything else is a waste of time, effort, intelligence, productive application, and wealth itself. What cannot be transformed into money has no value in exchange and might as well be left to rot. Use values have no value in exchange Use values that have no value in exchange count for nothing, and the labor that went into their production is socially speaking invalid and was thus worthlessly expended. What matters is not the satisfaction of needs. What matters is the avoidance of devaluation and bankruptcy through the valorization of capital. The value validity of the expended labor time is of the essence. For the dependent seller of labor power, the consequences are formidable. From increased pressure to make her expenditure of labor count as a socially valid expenditure that assumes the form of money, cutting down on meal times, speeding up, etc., to wages pressure and loss of employment, weakening the strength of her link to the means of subsistence. The world of value is an inhospitable world. Empathy, human warmth, and fellow feelings do not make money. Nothing is personal. Everything is just business. On the pain of ruin, money needs to be made. How long a time, then, did this concrete labor take, and how much quicker could it have been expended? What is its productivity relative to all other appropriated social labor, and what needs to be done to enhance it, to sustain its social validity as a labor of money-making? Time is money. This section argues that the capitalist subject is a value subject of profitable equivalent exchange relations. It expounds the means of this last sentence. Exchange is either an exchange between equivalent values or it is profitable. In bourgeois society, it is both, a contradiction in terms which is, quote, immanent to its reality, end quote. What is exchanged, and what is the critical category of a profitable equivalence exchange relationship? The section explores the value subject as a class subject, and expounds surplus value as the critical category of an equivalent exchange between unequal values. In Adorno's argument, quote, the law which determines how the fatality of mankind unfolds itself is the law of exchange, end quote. The exchange relations are equivalent exchange relations. Between two equal value things, there is no difference or distinction. That is, quote, 100 pounds worth of lead or iron is as of great a value as 100 pounds worth of silver or gold, end quote. The act of an equivalent exchange, therefore, quote, implies the reduction of the products to be exchanged to their equivalents, to something abstract, but by no means, as traditional discussion would maintain, to something material, end quote. The substance of value equivalence cannot be found in the, quote, geometrical, physical, chemical, or other natural property of commodities. Such properties come into consideration only to the extent that they make the commodities useful, i.e., turn them into use values, end quote. Value equivalence expresses something invisible that is, however, neither divine nor natural in character. Rather, it is an entirely social substance which becomes visible in the money form. The traditional idea that money expresses the value of a commodity is uncritical. It supposes value as a substance that is innate to individual commodities. However, the value of a commodity is its social value. Its value is thus a property of exchangeability, and money is the independent social form of that property. In clarification, money is not the measure of value. This conception presupposes a pre-monetary existence of value. 100 pounds of this is the same as 100 pounds of that. Concrete labor produces this and that, but what labor produces 100 pounds? Contrary to the traditional theory of value, this or that expenditure of labor does not count. What counts is the social validity of this or that expenditure of labor. Marx conceives of the socially valid labor as abstract labor. Whether this or that expenditure of concrete labor represents a socially necessary and therewith valid expenditure of social labor, of abstract labor, becomes clear only in exchange for money. Money is the socially valid form of measurability. What cannot be exchanged for money has no value validity and is thus worthless. It is a failed commodity which weighs like a noose around the necks of those who committed an expenditure of a concrete labor that turned out to be socially unnecessary and is therefore not, quote, measurable, end quote, in the form of a certain quantity of money. The logic of abstract labor, of the socially necessary expenditure of labor by the dissociated producers, quote, holds sway in reality itself, end quote. It is independent from the specific temporalities of the individual expenditures of concrete labor and yet results, quote, from the actions of the producers, end quote. Socially necessary labor time is not fixed and given. Socially necessary labor time is a fluid category. Its establishment is, quote, no greater an abstraction and is no less real than the resolution of all organic bodies into air, end quote. The dynamic of capitalist wealth comprises a, quote, social process that goes on behind the backs of the producers, end quote, yet it is their work. Adorno's negative dialectics presents the law of value with a reference to Marx's concept of socially necessary labor time. In Adorno's words, quote, society determined by exchange, end quote, entails a, quote, abstract element, end quote, that does not manifest something material in the traditional sense of the word. In fact, what is exchanged are, quote, average necessary amounts of labor time, end quote. This reduction of the product to, quote, social labor time necessarily disregards the specific forms of the object to be exchanged. Instead, they are reduced to a universal unit, end quote. Marx's familiar definition of the social constitution of value, quote, socially necessary labor time is the labor time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production normal for a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in that society, end quote, expresses its social character in the form of a universal commensurability of a time made abstract. This time appears as a force of nature. Everybody labors to make the cut in time, and then the value validity of the expended labor is affected or denied in exchange. Whether something has value is a matter of exchangeability and measurability, and what is exchanged are equal amounts of socially necessary labor time. In capitalism, quote, time is ontologized, end quote. This ontologized time is the time of value, and the time of value is the socially necessary labor time. The value validity of expended labor is like a ghost that either becomes visible in the form of money or it does not, in which case it becomes visible in the form of a hard-hitting invisible hand. The holy trinity of social labor, socially necessary labor time, and value validity in exchange is invisible. Its objectivity is spectral. I have argued that the ghost-like objectivity of value becomes visible in the money form. Back in production, the ghost of value appears as a vampire that feeds on living labor as the human material of valorization. Socially necessary labor time is not fixed and given. The labor time that, quote, was yesterday undoubtedly socially necessary for the production of a yard of linen ceases to be so today, end quote. With the concrete expenditure of labor time is a valid, socially necessary expenditure of labor time can only be established post festum in exchange. On the pain of ruin, the expenditure of living labor is thus done in the hope that it will turn out to be socially necessary, and that it will thus achieve value validity in exchange with money. Quote, time is money, end quote, said Benjamin Franklin, and one might add, therefore, that money is time. If, then, capitalism reduces everything to time, an abstract time that is dissociated from concrete human circumstances and purposes, then time really is everything. Quote, if, quote, time is everything, then man is nothing. He is, at most, a time's carcass, end quote. A carcass of, quote, personified labor time, end quote. Expenditure of socially valid labor does not occur in its own good time. It occurs within time, that is, the time of value as expenditure of socially necessary labor time. The abstraction of the exchange process, quote, lies, therefore, not in the abstracting mode of thought by the sociologist, but in sociology itself, end quote. Adorno. Something abstract, intangible, and invisible holds sway in reality and compels its conduct. Finally, returning to the point that the capitalist exchange relations posit the exchange of money for more money as an equivalent exchange between unequal values, money prime. How does money, quote, bring forth living offsprings, end quote? What appears in the appearance of an equivalent exchange of money as more money is the, quote, difference between the labor time expended by the worker and that needed for the reproduction of his life, end quote. The fundamental relationship is thus between the value of labor value and the value produced by the consumption of labor power during the social working day. The mysterious character of an equivalent exchange of money for more money has thus to do with the transformation of the commodity labor power into a surplus value producing resource. Money production, money prime. For the sake of more money, the curtailment of the labor time spent by the worker to reproduce the value of labor power is of the essence. It is the condition for extending the surplus labor time beyond the time necessary for the simple reproduction of society. This extended labor time is the source of the expansion of social wealth, creating a surplus in value, the foundation of profit. The understanding, then, of the mysterious character of an equivalence exchange between unequal values of money for more money lies, quote, in the concept of surplus value, end quote. Adorno thus argues that the equivalence exchange relations are founded, quote, on the class relationship, end quote, between the owners of the means of production and the producers of surplus value, and he argues that this social relationship vanishes in its economic appearance as an exchange between one quantity of money for another. Economic thought identifies the properties of the economic categories as the revealed truth of society. Economic thought recognizes the profitable accumulation of some abstract form of wealth for its own sake as a social necessity. Economic thought's identification of profit as a social necessity is not untrue. Failure to make a profit entails great danger. To the vanishing point of death, the life of the sellers of labor power hangs by the success of turning her living labor into a profitable means for its buyer. The profitability of her labor is the fundamental condition of achieving sustained wage-based employment. Yesterday's profitable appropriation of surplus labor buys the labor power of another man today, the buyer for the sake of making money, so that he avoids bankruptcy by enriching himself, the seller, in order to make a living through wage income. In the book Capital, it doesn't actually say in the book Capital, but I don't know. I feel like I have to compensate for the lack that I can't speak in italics, so people don't know if I'm talking about the book Capital or Capital, the social relation. In the book Capital, Marx develops the capitalist class relations from the sale of the commodity labor power. In truth, however, quote, the sale of labor power presupposes coercion as the foundation of its sale, end quote. The labor market is the institution that regulates the economic compulsion to make ends meet in the form of an equal exchange relationship between the traders in labor power. Behind the freedom of trade stands the free laborer who, divorced from the means of subsistence, is at liberty to enter into contracts of employment. On the other side of freedom is the daily struggle to secure the means of subsistence through wage income and to curtail the buyer's acquired right to consume the seller's labor power no matter what during the contracted hours of work. Freedom appears in the form of the economic compulsion to trade labor power for a wage, and not only that, it appears also in the necessity to produce surplus value for its buyers as the condition of future employment. The struggle for employment and conditions takes the form of a competition between the sellers of labor power on a global scale. For the seller of labor power, competition is not some abstract economic law. Rather, it is conceptuality. Its conceptuality is experienced in the form of precarious labor markets, wage pressure, risk to redundancy, and loss of income. quote, proletarian language is dictated by hunger, end quote. Class society exists in the form of individualized commodity owners, each seeking to maintain themselves in competitive, gendered, racialized, and territorialized labor markets, where the term, quote, cutthroat competition, end quote, is experienced in various forms, from arson attack to class solidarity, and from destitution to collective bargaining, from gangland thuggery to communal forms of organizing, subsistence support, from strike breaking to collective action, nationalist flag waving to international solidarity strikes. For the science of economic matter, the unemployed represent an economic zero, since they lack both in productive contribution and effective demand. This economic calculation of the unemployed is not untrue. It makes clear that the life of the traders of labor power really, quote, hangs by, end quote, the profitability extraction of surplus value. Laboring for the sake of a surplus in value is innate to the concept of the worker. She belongs to a system of wealth in which her laboring existence has a utility only as a means of surplus value extraction. Her subsistence depends on the profitability of her living labor. Contrary to a whole tradition of Marxist theory, and critical theory too, from Habermas to Honneth, and from Fraser to Yegi, the social relations of production do not harbor within themselves a, quote, progressivist, end quote, resolution through schemes of communicative action, recognition, or application of Marxian economics. They harbor within themselves the requirement of surplus value extraction from the living labor of dispossessed workers. Surplus value extraction is the condition of social reproduction in capitalist society. Unprofitable buyers of labor power go out of business. Profitable ones maintain demand for labor power. The profitable accumulation of yesterday's yield of surplus value is the condition of today's wage-based access to the means of subsistence. The dispossessed surplus value producers do not struggle for abstract ideas. They struggle to make a living, and they work for profit. Looking on the bright side of the wrong world. I have argued that economic reproduction is social reproduction. It takes place, quote, in and through, end quote, the perverted, quote, totality, end quote, of the social relations of economic objectivity that feed on the surplus value producing labor of a class of, quote, there's no quote. I have argued that economic reproduction is social reproduction. It takes place, quote, in and through, end quote, the perverted, quote, totality, end quote, of the social relations of economic objectivity that feed on the surplus value producing labor of a class of dispossessed workers. For Adorno, quote, the organic nature of capitalist society is both an actuality and, at the same time, a socially necessary illusion. The illusion signifies that within this society laws can only be implemented as natural processes over people's heads, while their validity arises from the form of the relations of production within which production takes place. End quote. Adorno's critical theory holds that the forces of production do not manifest some economic nature. Rather, they manifest, quote, congealed relationships which have become autonomous, objectified vis-a-vis human beings, end quote. Adorno thus rejects the orthodox conception of dialectics between the forces of production as some trans-historically active economic nature and the historically specific relations of production as a, quote, perverter of Marxian motives, end quote. Adorno criticizes it as a, quote, metaphysics, end quote, which conceives of history as a, quote, basic ontological structure of things in being, end quote, in which, as Patrick Murray puts it, quote, the forces of production, end quote, are not social form determined, but, on the contrary, are the ultimate determination of, quote, relations of production, end quote, end quote. The traditional view not only naturalizes the economic categories, it also, Adorno argues, denies the, quote, spontaneity of the subject, a movens of the objective dialectics of the forces and relations of production, end quote. In his understanding, the forces of production manifest, quote, relationships between human beings, and not as they appear to us as the properties of things, end quote, end quote. What therefore appears in the appearance of society as an object of the economic forces is not some general economic nature that imposes itself behind the backs of the individuals. Rather, what appears as the actual social relations in the form of what appears are the actual social relations in the form of independent economic forces. Economic abstractions as such do not exist except as a negative ontology of, quote, perverted, end quote, social relations. The reality in which the social individuals move day in and day out has no invariant character. That is, something which exists independently from them. As a critical theory of society, and is argued here with reference to Alfred Schmidt, the critique of political economy amounts to a conceptualized social praxis in the form of the economic object. That is, the entire meaning of the, quote, relations of production resides precisely in the fact that we are here concerned not with direct action, but, if you like, congealed action, or with some form of congealed labor, end quote, or with society in the form of independent economic forces. Economic nature is a social nature. Economic nature's reality is immanent to its own social context. The crucial category of economic objectivity is the concept of surplus value as the, quote, invisible and unknown essence, end quote, of profit. It is produced by a class of dispossessed sellers of labor power whose access to the means of subsistence depends on the profitability of their living labor. Surplus value is the difference between the value of the commodity labor power and the total value extracted from the commodity labor power's consumption during the social working day. To be an unexploitable worker is a fate much worse than being an exploited worker. How to make a living without wage income? What can be traded if labor power can't? How many for organ sales? The producers of surplus value belong to a world that is, quote, hostile to the subject, end quote, and the equivalent exchange relations between the buyers of labor power and its sellers presuppose coercion in the conceptuality of social freedom and equality. Bourgeois society does not contain within itself the promise of freedom from want. Rather, bourgeois society contains within itself dispossessed producers of surplus value who struggle to dodge the, quote, freedom to starve, end quote, as personifications of surplus labor time. Adorno's dictum that, quote, society remains class struggle, end quote, does not express something positive or desirable. Adorno's negative dialectics of the false society resists the bright side view. It holds that, quote, the abolition of hunger requires a change in the relations of production, end quote.